books on Dr. King, as you well know, looking primarily at his cultural roots and legacy, taking into account his impact not only on the civil rights struggle in this country, but human rights struggles worldwide. So I'm still involved in that after more than 30 years and working at presently on a number of works on Martin Luther King Jr. and looking primarily at his legacy and what that means for us as we continue the struggle for a nation and a world free of racism and sexism and all of the other isms.
And dealing with social justice.
That's right, social justice, human dignity, equality of opportunity. Those are major themes in my writings. And as you well know, they were very important for Dr. King. Who a lot of people don't realize was very much concerned not only about what was happening in this country, but what was happening throughout the world in terms of the violation of people's human rights under systems of colonialism and neo-colonialism, etc.
So very good. And so, Dr. Baldwin, let's see if we can sort of define what we mean when we say talk about African Americans and sports and social justice. We've got about 2 minutes before this segment.
I think there's a long history of African American athletes using sports as a platform for addressing social justice issues. And of course, we get into that history a little later. But as you well know, African Americans have always had to use whatever platform was available to deal with these issues. We've done it through the sphere of music and art. We've done it through the sphere of athletics and of course, the church. Whatever avenue was available for pursuing human rights and human dignity and freedom and justice, we've used that platform. And of course, sports figures have been no different. They've always used sports as a kind of platform, and that goes back, as you well know, as far back as Jackie Robinson, who in 1947 broke the color barrier in baseball. He became the first African American to play in the major leagues in baseball.
You're very good, and of course Jackie Robinson was only one of the first in baseball, but there were many others in all kinds of sports that sort of distinguished themselves to such a point that they drew attention.
Exactly. Now Jackie Robinson is very important because he was a pioneer. I think we have to call him a pioneer in the struggle. He didn't do very much when he was playing baseball because, for obvious reasons, he was concerned very much about reprisals. But after he retired from baseball in 1957, he became a writer. He wrote columns for the New York Post and the New York Amsterdam News. And in those columns, he addressed racial issues. He actually worked with Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1950s and 60s, addressing issues from Jim Crow in the South to poverty to South African apartheid. So there was a very close relationship between Jackie Robinson and Dr. King.
Very good. And so in a real sense, Dr. Baldwin, as you will probably explain later on, that these individuals played a significant role in terms of the sports, but at the same time they were able to reach out and make people understand that they did enjoy a special situation that was not generally open to other Africans at the time.
They brought that same competitive spirit that they took into sports into the field of human rights and civil rights.
Okay, and so we'll take our first commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
Colin Kaepernick.
However you want to do it, you know. So this is an 8-minute segment, and I think we've laid the foundation for whatever you wish to deal with in reference to that, and that's one thing that, you know, sports is so important in terms of what we do, because everybody's waiting on the Super Bowl now and playoffs.
It's yet another platform for us as African Americans to address injustice.
That's right. That's
Paul Robeson said it.
You
know, W.B.
Ready? Stand by.
Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Louis Baldwin, former professor at Vanderbilt University, retired professor from Vanderbilt University, and he's given us some information in reference to African Americans, national sports associations, and civil rights in a real sense, Dr. Baldwin. I mean, we might have muddled the title in reference to moving them around here or there, but essentially what we're saying is that athletes have played a significant role in terms of the history of Africans dealing with social justice.
Yes, and it began not only with, it begins with Jackie Robinson. Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr. called Jackie Robinson a sit-inner before there were sit-ins, a freedom rider before there were freedom rides. But it didn't stop with Jackie Robinson. He was a pioneer. You have to also look at 1968. The Summer Olympics in Mexico City, when Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised their fist, the Black Power salute, was a protest against social injustice in the United States. And you look, of course, at Muhammad Ali and his activities. In 1960, he was an Olympic gold medalist, won the heavyweight boxing championship in 1964. But in 1967, he refused to respond to the draft and to get involved in the war in Vietnam. And of course, he lost his boxing title. His license, boxing license, was suspended. And of course, he became an outcast. And you look, of course, today at Colin Kaepernick, who is involved in the kneeling activities at football games. And we have to keep in mind that kneeling has long been a part of the black struggle for justice. You had what were called kneel-ins
in the streets.
Albany in 1962.
Yeah, very good.
You had kneel-ins in Selma in 1965. So this is nothing new. But the idea of taking a knee is very, very symbolic. It means, of course, resistance against the struggle of injustice, and particularly the issues involving police misconduct and the relations of African Americans with law enforcement. I think these people like Colin Kaepernick and others in the pro football, NFL, are making essentially the same statement that Jackie Robinson made, that Tommy Smith and John Carlos made, that Muhammad Ali made, and that, of course, is that we are not going to tolerate injustice. Taking a knee is very constitutional. It means standing up for right. Okay?
And it's not against the United States flag.
It's not against the flag. It's very much. Dr. King always said regarding the sit-inners that by sitting down, they were standing up for the very best in the American dream. And I would argue by taking a knee, Colin Kaepernick and others are standing up for the very best in the American dream, which involved, of course, this idea of the right to protest for rights.
Rights,
The right to protest
That's what the First
right.
Amendment should be about. I think you've talked about the Second Amendment quite often on this particular show. But that, that's part of the First Amendment to be able to do that.
Yes, absolutely.
Very good.
So I think Kaepernick is standing in a long tradition. He's being accused of disrespecting the flag, disrespecting the national anthem, disrespecting even our troops who are fighting abroad. But that's not what it's all about. I think LeBron James was probably right when he says that Kaepernick stands very much in the tradition of people like Martin Luther King and others, in the sense that he feels that if you're going to make a statement about social justice issues, you got to not only speak, you got to act. And there will be...
and be prepared for those who are going to try to act against you.
Exactly, because there will be consequences in terms of material and the physical. You're going to lose a lot of resources. And of course, we know now that Colin Kaepernick is a free agent. He hasn't been hired by any particular NFL team. So he's suffering some of the same consequences and abuses that Martin Luther King Jr. suffered, that Jackie Robinson suffered. that Tommy Smith and John Carlos suffered after they gave the Black Power salute at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. So there's a price to be paid. And we see that happening, of course, in the case of Colin Kaepernick.
And certainly it's in sports, but it's also all across the board.
Exactly.
Those who oppose anything that's against the Constitution, against the status quo, will be subject in a real sense to whatever was done, reprisal or whatever.
Abuses, and of course people have always been outraged when black sports figures take a stand for social justice. It happened, of course, with Jackie Robinson. It happened with Tommy Smith and John Carlos. It happened with Muhammad Ali. And of course now, of course, it's happening with Colin Kaepernick.
And I'm reminded, as you well know, it happened with David Walker.
Exactly.
David Walker's appeal.
In 1829.
That's right. That went way back.
He published the appeal in 1829. 1830, they found him dead.
That's right. That's right.
Yes.
So it's, there are all those.
There's always a price to be paid.
There's a price to be paid.
Materially and sometimes physically.
That's right. And so we ought to support those individuals who are willing, because when they stand out, they are standing for all of us who are not standing out. For whatever reason we have for not standing out, they're out there.
They're making a statement not only in terms of this quest for civil rights, but the quest for human rights. And human rights are very, very important, and it speaks to the global situation, I think.
You know, Dr. Baldwin, I think we're getting ready for the second commercial break, and I think that will give us a chance to go into this last segment, because I think this is the second segment, is it not?
Yeah.
Oh, is it? You know, I've been dealing with this. I've been dealing with this all day long, and so I sometimes become confused in reference to the second or the third segment. But this is the end of the second segment, and so what we'll do when we come back during the final segment, we'll give you an opportunity to further elaborate upon anything that you wish to talk about dealing with the current athletic situation, or some of the things that you might have wanted to talk about before you got here, but it never crossed your mind. But now this will give you an opportunity to talk about those things that you said that you wanted to talk about before you got in that chair.
Thank you.
And that'll make sure that you won't leave here saying that I should have said. I think that's the way all of us feel when we find loved ones that have passed out of our lives, and we all wish that we would have said something at that particular time. But whatever you think that you ought to say, this will be your time to say it when we come back during this last 10 minutes. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
Thank you.
I've got one show after this, and this will be 5 shows.
That's
for
good.
Today.
You're done for the day then.
Yeah, but done for the day. So you've not had a chance to do anything in reference to some of the other things you're trying to do?
Well, I have a chapter in my most recent. Yes.
Thank you, and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin, and he's given us some information relative to African Americans, national sports associations, and civil rights. And so, Dr. Baldwin, within that context, let's give you the last 10 minutes to talk about some of the things that you'd like to talk about.
I'll begin with Dr. King. Before he died in 1968, he felt that sports figures should also be a model for how we address issues of social justice and social concern. And he saw Muhammad Ali, as a model for that. You know, for what he expected of sports figures throughout the athletic world, that they too had to get involved in this struggle for equal rights and social justice. And I think what we've seen with Colin Kaepernick in the National Football League is that players throughout the league have joined him in these kneeling ceremonies, I call them. And that's very, very important, because they're concerned not only about the black community's relationships with law enforcement the criminal justice system, but they're concerned about the larger issue of civil rights and human rights. People should be treated as human beings. And I think that this is what Dr. King had in mind. And so when people like LeBron James and others referred to Kaepernick as standing in that tradition, I think they're quite right. Because in the movement today, and you know what's happening in our world today, you know what's happening in the nation today, there's a move toward isolationism in terms of international policy in this country. Civility is declining.
Almost disappeared
exactly.
in many instances.
You have problems with economic injustice and the rise of poverty worldwide, the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. And I think it's very, very important for not only preachers and churches and people in the music field, but also people in sports to be involved, to have not only a voice, but to actually participate in actions, in protests, in acts of resistance and defiance, to bring about what Dr. King called this beloved community.
You have absolutely no idea, Dr. Baldwin, unless you recognize that when they pay to go out to a stadium and you've got 103,000 people looking on, you have no idea of the kind of influence that you have in reference to the words that you use.
That's what Dr. King always said. He said sports figures are known internationally. They are respected internationally. They bring a certain kind of competitive spirit to the sports, to the football fields, to the basketball courts, to the tennis courts. Okay, to the boxing rings. And you need to bring that same kind of competitive spirit to the struggle for civil and human rights. He saw Ali as exemplifying that, okay? He saw Jackie Robinson as exemplifying that. And I think as we look to the future, we need athletes to stand up. We already see that in the Pro Football League. We don't see it enough in basketball. We don't see it in boxing. We don't see it in tennis. We don't see it in these other national sports. And I think we need to see more of that, because if we're going to create a society and a world free of oppression and free of injustice and free of economic inequality, we got to have people in all fields, all endeavors involved in this particular struggle. And
no matter how they might do it, either by kneeling or whatever they might do, or speaking out or whatever, there's always one way to do things that you can do it safely. You don't always have to jeopardize a contract in order to protest, you see. And so there are ways that you can do things and et cetera, and you believe that that's a platform that should be used much more.
I believe very much, as Dr. King believed, that you got to be willing to sacrifice materially and physically in order to bring about the kind of changes that we need in this world and in this society. And I think he saw in Ali and Jackie Robinson and others that capacity to look beyond themselves, to really what? Devote their lives to the service of humanity.
And so, Dr. Baldwin, we've got about 4 minutes before we end this show for today. And what I'd like for you to do now is to reflect upon some of the things that you wanted to say dealing with this particular topic before you got here, but you've not had an opportunity to express. And so that you won't leave here getting down the road and saying, I should have said. This is your should have said moment.
Exactly. Now, my concern today is that not enough people in pro sports really, are supporting Colin Kaepernick. You have owners of pro football teams, other pro sports, who have not really made the kind of statement that they can make. It's not enough for pro football players to take a knee. You have to also see that in pro basketball. You have to see it in tennis. You have to see it in other areas of sports. And we're not seeing enough of that because the struggle for a better world continues in the 21st century. And we know that the problem of the 21st century, as W.B. Du
Yeah,
Bois said in the 20th
it
century, will
has been.
continue to be the problem of the color line. It will be the problem of the religion divide.